Hey. Okay. Now, are you outside?
Yeah.
Good. How is your semester going?
Like, because it's my first semester,
Yes,
I feel like I'm confused.
really.
Like, yeah,
So is this your first semester?
yeah.
Wow.
Especially that my English is like my second language.
Oh, really?
And like, this is the second year I'm speaking English, so there's a lot of things.
Still have to adjust to. Where are you from?
From Saudi Arabia.
Oh, okay. And I can't imagine doing this in a different language. Unless it- Yeah. Okay. Have you studied English in Saudi Arabia?
No, actually, I studied here for 1 year.
Wow. It has been online until now.
100 SMU.
do you know what we're looking at here? Speaking of mystery photos, anyone know what this scene is? One of the buildings is still there. That is the old State House, yes. So the yellow brick building. Hey, how you doing? And what direction are we looking? Excuse me? Yeah, we are looking west. Yeah, we're actually looking toward government center, government center. And can you tell about when this is? Hi. Good afternoon. How are we doing today?
Fantastic.
Good to hear it. Anyone remember when the old State House, we were just looking at this picture, this painting, and trying to figure out when it happens and where it is, which we've gotten where, and we've gotten where the artist is standing. Now we're just trying to pick up when this might have been painted.
Is that early 1700s?
Why would you say early 1700s?
Seems to be quite a lot of buildings.
Yeah, there are a lot of
The way
buildings.
they're dressed too.
Yeah. Must have like the carriages and this.
Okay. So those are all clues as to when, because people are dressed in a certain way. That's good. Yes, Emma.
I think the old State House was built in 1713, so
That's right.
it would have to be at least after that.
Okay, so we know it must be after 1713. Sonia, were you going to say something?
Oh, no.
Okay, so it must be after 1713. And let's see, is there anything else that indicates when this might be? There are, well, people pointed out there's carriages, horses. This building is the first church that was built at about the same time as the old State House. It's no longer there. And here, this cupola is on a courthouse, which roughly was where the City Hall Annex is. It's been, I think the school committee was there until they moved to Roxbury. But yeah, there was a courthouse here. And then this is what had been King Street. It's actually, this was painted in 1804. So early 1800s as opposed to early 1700s. But there's no reason you would get that precise. Okay. So this is our mystery painting for today. Any questions about anything else? I just started off as kind of an icebreaker, which I don't know if it broke much ice, but okay. So any questions about anything else? I sent you your assignments for the eminent Bostonian. Did you get those? So now you can communicate with the other person or persons you're working with and figure that out.
Allison,
Yes. Is that
sorry, I just have a question. So on Henry Lee, like, I know we were doing like the whole library stuff. Like, did you want us to research off the school site?
research wherever you can?
Okay, because I've been trying to find stuff, So okay, I was just making sure.
Through the Suffolk Library site, you have access to the Boston Globe, which should be helpful for most.
Oh yeah, okay, that's a good idea.
Be a source, and you also you should know what organization he started, so you could look into that. And so, and others, anyone else have questions about your person? So what I want your next step is to write like a summary or précis of what the person did, why the person or people is or are important. And then, so that's first and the next step, which you should be doing, okay? And as a reminder, Thursday, we have an event at 3 o'clock. Nancy Seychelles talking about the Atlas of Boston History. Great book, you'll enjoy seeing that. And then at 6, I will do a Zoom meeting for those who want to talk about Boston history. Okay, I realize some of you have other obligations at that point, but I will be available via Zoom, and I apologize for not being able to be here at our regularly scheduled time. If you do attend the Nancy Seychelles event, you get some kind of extra credit on your final grade. I think Sana remembers you may remember what the extra credit was. Was it 10%? Was it automatic A? I can't remember what it was, I promise.
Oh, automatic A.
Yeah, so it's my way of
Just kidding.
So, okay. Other questions? Yes, Emma.
So did that pass?
So, excuse me, one second, Sana. Emma had a question.
That summary, did you want us to submit it on the blog?
Yeah, just submit it. Well, why don't you send it by email?
Okay.
Okay. Good. Okay. Yes, Sana.
Oh God, I'm sorry. I have a lot going on my plate. Did that thing that you're talking about, did that already pass? That event?
What thing?
The one that you want us to attend for extra?
This coming Thursday.
Okay, I'm gonna write that down right now. Okay.
Thursday, 3 o'clock. I'll post again or send again a link so everyone can figure out where it is. Okay, good. Other questions? Okay, so let us see. What were we talking about last time? Or I should say, what was I talking about, since I'm the only one who ever gets a word in edgewise.
King James II in the Catholic Church. Parliament gets a new royal family. That's the last one.
Okay.
The fire ended on the fire.
Ended on the fire, okay. And it was the fire that led to the building of all of this, right? In 1711, Great Fire, and that's good. It'll do you well to remember King James and the Glorious Revolution. I think anyone else have anything else you remember from our last encounter? Okay, so we have the new Boston built in 1713. By the way, this is the first of what will be many new Bostons. It's something I keep trying to figure out when it is we create a new Boston. This may be the first, well, actually the first, I suppose, was in 1630 when Boston was created. And then we have this one, the old Boston is burned, new one created. And here's another kind of interesting story. Roughly every 12 years since Boston was founded, and what year was Boston founded? Thank you, 1630. Okay. Boston had a smallpox epidemic. Smallpox was the most devastating disease in the history of the human race. for every 10 people who contracted smallpox, 3 would die. More in some cases, depending on the population, et cetera. And if you did not die from smallpox, you quite likely would be left insane, crippled, or blind. Or at the very least, you would be left with scars on your face showing that you had had smallpox. Now, the good news is, once you have had smallpox, you can never get it again. And the disease itself has an incubation period of about 7 days to 17 days. So you may have this disease and not be aware of it for a week or 2 weeks. And during that time, of course, you're in contact with other people who are being exposed to this disease. And then after about 20 days, in some cases fewer, you develop a rash, bumps, and other signs that you have the smallpox. One of the physicians in Boston described it this way: purple spots, the bloody and parchment pox. A pock is a pustule that breaks out on your skin filled with pus, and this is what leaves then the marks if you survive. And these pustules can spread through your body, over your body, into your mouth and your ears, and thus, and hemorrhages of blood, the mouth, the nose, the fundament and privities, ravings and deliriums, convulsions and other fits, violent inflammations and swellings in the eyes and throat, so they cannot see, hear, or scarcely breathe, or swallow anything to keep them from starving. Some look as black as the stock, others as white as a sheet. In some, the pock runs into blisters. The skin, stripping off, leaves the flesh raw. Some have been filled with loathsome ulcers. Others have had deep fistulous ulcers in their bodies or in their limbs or joints, and many blind all their days. Horrific disease, smallpox. The good news is, hi Kathleen, I thought you tuned in on the...
I was online while I was walking.
Oh, okay, good. Well, good to have you with us. The good news is smallpox has been eradicated from the planet. And the last case to occur naturally was in the 1970s. And it was actually a major undertaking between the 1950s and 1970s to eliminate smallpox as a disease. However, it would strike fairly regularly, and Boston being a port town with contact primarily with the West Indies, the disease would come here fairly regularly. Now, as I said, the good news is once you've been exposed to it and survive it, you'll never get it again. So what you'll see is a population has been affected by smallpox. The survivors cannot get it again. So it's going to take a while for a new population to emerge, which has not been exposed to it. The last epidemic in Boston, in 1702, there was an epidemic in Boston. And then there would not be another one for 19 years. In 1713, there was a measles outbreak that did carry off a lot of people, including the wife of Cotton Mather, this gentleman here. I think I mentioned his really elaborate wig last time. And 3 of the Mather's children died of the measles outbreak in 1713. But everyone knew smallpox might come back. It might come back at any time, and there's really nothing we can do. Yes, Kathleen.
So like now when we have COVID, we have certain steps and necessary precautions to take from curbing the disease. My question is back then when there wasn't really as like much knowledge on disease control or and it's mostly religious based. So like the way people aren't really looking for medicine and stuff like that. So what was the precautions they took when the smallpox epidemic?
That's a very good question. And I'll get to that because it's not clear what you can do about smallpox. And it's not clear what you can do for people suffering from smallpox. And what happens is Cotton Mather, who's a minister, the minister at the North Meeting House. He's the assistant minister. Cotton Mather's father was Increase Mather. This is Increase Mather, Cotton Mather's father. And Increase Mather probably was the leading New England minister of the late 1600s. He was president of Harvard. In fact, he is the only president of Harvard who did not live in Cambridge. He was born here. His father, Richard Mather, was the first minister in Dorchester. And then Increase Mather grows up, graduates from the College of New England, and then when the Charles I is executed, Increase Mather goes back to England, and he preaches in England. Much happier being in England than he is back here in what was very much a provincial place. However, Increase Mather, when Charles II comes to the throne, does return to Boston and becomes the minister at the North Church in the North End, and then is, when he is elected president of Harvard, or chosen to be president of Harvard, he says, it's bad enough I have to live in Boston, I'm not going to live in Cambridge. But they were so interested in having Increase Mather as their president, they said, okay, you can live in Boston and be president of Harvard. And leading theologian, he's the one who goes back to England to negotiate a new charter in the 1680s successfully. And Cotton, well, let me see how we can put this. Increase Mather marries it's kind of complicated because often women die in childbirth, their husbands marry someone else, and in this case, how to put this, his father is Richard Mather, and he marries successively the daughter of John Cotton and the widow of John Cotton. John Cotton is probably the leading Puritan minister of the early 1600s, and Increase Mather marries both his daughter and his widow, not the mother of the woman he had been married to, but you see it's complicated. For those of you who think families have never been complicated before, and they name one of their children Cotton Mather. Now, poor Cotton Mather, I should say more about him because he is an important figure. And if
He a minister?
he is a minister, yes. So he's named for John Cotton and for Increase Mather. He's named for the two leading ministers of the 1600s. And Cotton Mather is a brilliant theologian. Have I talked more about Cotton Mather to this group?
You talked about it on the first day and the second day.
Okay, so I already see, now I'm fearing that I'm becoming obsessive, and you'll think all he does is talk about Cotton Mather. I'm sorry. Cotton Mather is the youngest person ever admitted to Harvard. He's 12 years old, and he is brilliant kid. And this is at a time when they didn't think of kids. And his father is the leading minister of New England. His grandfathers, John Cotton and Richard Mather, were among the leading ministers of the early century. And he goes to Harvard. I don't know if any of you have experience with being exceptionally bright. And I'm sure you all do. I shouldn't have said that. You all know what it's like to be exceptionally bright. Emma's shaking her head. No, she doesn't. She's just saying that because she knows in some cultures, and I hate to tell you this, the undergraduate class at Harvard was one of these. Kids who are older than this precocious son of the leading minister of New England weren't as impressed with him as they might have been. And they bullied poor Cotton Mather and did other things to make his life unpleasant. And he emerges from Harvard, brilliant academic record, as well as a very pronounced stutter. Now, The occupation for which he was preparing himself, of course, was the ministry. And he was gifted as a minister in understanding theology, understanding the scriptures. Yes, Emma?
So was he going into graduating Harvard at like 16 if he went in?
Yes.
So now he's going to be a minister at 16?
Yeah. In order to be a minister, though, in this period, in this place, ministers are chosen by the congregation, which means you go to a congregation and you preach to them, and they decide whether or not they want to hire you as a minister. And no one wanted Cotton Mather. Notwithstanding how brilliant he was, they listened to him stutter, and they asked, do we really want to listen to this for several hours on a Sunday? And of course, stuttering is one of these things that feeds on itself. The only position he can find as a minister is to be his father's assistant. His father, the minister of the North Church in the North End. Now, he could have anticipated, since his father, at the time Cotton Mather graduated from Harvard and began his ministerial career, was not a young man, he was in his 40s, he might have anticipated at some point he might succeed his father as the pastor of the meeting house in the North End. But Increase Mather lives another 45 years into the 1720s. In fact, he dies just 4 years before his son Cotton. So during those decades, Cotton Mather is his father's assistant, which does give him more time to write. And he writes brilliantly. He writes the first real history of New England. And he also writes a concordance of the Bible. And he writes lots of other books. One of them, probably his most famous, is called, anyone know what Cotton Mather's most famous book is? See, no one knows it now, which is too bad. Bonifacius, which is Latin for essays to do good. That is, it's a book on how to do good. It's a book everyone would have read. Okay, Cotton Mather is also really interested in the natural world. He writes about the curiosities of New England. In fact, in 1714, he had an essay published in the Proceedings of the Transactions of the Royal Society. This is the leading scientific organization in the English-speaking world, the Royal Society of London. It's called Curiosa Americana, about curious things in America, things like turkeys and rattlesnakes and Native Americans and the natural environment. He has a microscope he uses to study things because he wants to understand this world as God created it. And so he's published in the Transactions of the Royal Society. And in the same issue, there is an essay by Emmanuel Timonius reporting on an outbreak of smallpox in Istanbul. And Timonius reports on a long-standing practice in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, when there is a smallpox outbreak, beginning in the winter or spring, a healthy person who contracts the disease after about 12 or 13 days, when we know this person has smallpox, what they'll do is they'll prick one of these pustules and take some of the pus out of it and press this into a clean vessel, put it into a stopped bottle so nothing can contaminate it. They'll keep it warm, and then they'll find another healthy person and make some cuts in that person's arm or sometimes in their chest to make it bleed a little bit. Then they'll mix some of this stuff with it and cover this with a walnut shell and bind that to you. And after, what happens is about 10 or 20 pustules will break out on that person's arm. They're very small. And then they dry up and fall off. And very rarely do they leave any pits or any indication. And that person will never get smallpox. They've been doing this for about 40 years, but only in the last 8 have they had real success with it. This, to Mather, is an amazing thing. And it's confirmed for him because he has in his household an enslaved man whom Mather has named Onesimus, after an enslaved person in the New Testament who runs away and is returned to his master. Onesimus is from West Africa. And in West Africa, Onesimus reports that people had done the same thing. He said they take the juice of the smallpox and cutty skin and put in a drop. They buy and buy a little sicky, then very few little things like smallpox. And nobody die of it. And nobody have smallpox anymore. So Onesimus reports to Cotton Mather about this practice of inoculation being done in West Africa. At about the same time, Mather reads about the practice of inoculation being done in Turkey. Now, Mather wants to investigate this. And by the way, there are contrary reports on how effective this is. One doctor in Venice says that the practice of inoculation began in Izmir among a mean, coarse, rude sort of people. But Mather says, if I should live to see, he writes to the Royal Society, he's so amazed at this revelation. If I should live to see the smallpox again enter our city, I would immediately procure a consult of our physicians to introduce a practice which may be of so happy a tendency. So he's waiting. And then in April of 1721, he gets his chance. A ship from the Tortugas arrives in Boston carrying smallpox. Now, at the same time this is happening, there's a smallpox outbreak in London. And in London, they're beginning to practice inoculation. Now, the first reports are the ship arrives and the crew unloads the ship and then disperses. And then someone reports there was a man on the ship, a black man from the West Indies who had the smallpox. A physician goes to inspect. This guy's now renting a room in the North End. And by the time the physician goes to check out the ship, there are only 3 men left on this ship. The rest of the crew had dispersed. So everyone on that ship had been exposed to smallpox and wasn't aware of it. Now, every person they have contacted in Boston has been exposed to smallpox. What do you think is going to happen in Boston? Aside from the fact that now we know people are going to get smallpox. Yes, sir.
There's probably gonna be like a big scare with the people because disease is attributed to like the wrath of a god, right?
Well, it could be attributed. We don't know we don't really know what causes this disease. But we do know we're very likely to get it. Because we don't, yes, Kathleen.
Would be a herd immunity,
Excuse me?
like a herd immunity.
Well, if you had had smallpox 20 years ago, yeah, now you have immunity to it. But in order to get herd immunity, 30% of the people who've contracted smallpox are going to die. So it's going to be tough to get herd immunity when you're going to lose about 1/3 of the herd.
Yeah, because when they're doing, what do you call when they put the disease into the blood?
Inoculation.
Inoculation is basically their form of vaccination.
No.
It's a
Vaccination is using another disease that won't kill you.
Another disease.
And it's called vaccination. This comes about later in the century when a German doctor realizes that women who milk cows contract cowpox because it's a disease cows have that is similar to smallpox. You cannot die from, it's unlikely you're going to die from cowpox, And he realizes that if you put the cowpox virus into someone, they will also be immune to smallpox. Hence, this is the idea of vaccination, taking a different virus that will knock out the previous one, and called vaccine because the Latin word for vaca is what in Latin?
Cow.
Cow, thank you. Hispanic, okay, good. So that's why it's vaccination using a different disease. But we don't know that now. We don't know about this method people are using in West Africa or in Turkey. That is, they are taking a disease that could kill them and injecting it into healthy people. Would you want to be injected with a disease that could kill you? Yeah, it depends, okay. So what the selectmen in Boston know is that, well, probably there's smallpox and people are probably going to panic. So the selectmen decide to search houses to find infected people, and they report, we only found one person with the smallpox and we're sequestering him, okay? And they also hire 26 Black men and mulattoes to sweep the streets. So people will see the streets are being swept and they'll know there is no fear of smallpox. And at the end of May, there are 8 cases all in the North End. So the town officials really want to contain this. Now, Cotton Mather, who also lives in the North End, hears about this and he reports to the town and to all the doctors in the town about the wonderful practice of inoculation, something that he says has been used in Turkey, in Africa, in India, and China to prevent the spread of the disease. And every doctor in town, what do you think every doctor in town says? Emma's shaking her head. They say, this is the craziest thing we have ever heard. One doctor, though, disagrees. This is Dr. Zabdiel Boylston. Has anyone heard the name? You have, where have you heard the name Boylston?
Like the street,
There's a street, yes, yes,
train station.
yes. Boylston, well, the selectmen, by the way, in Boston also say, we are not going, not only are we not going to do this, we're not going to allow it because this is going to make people sick. Yeah, there is a big chance you're going to get smallpox, but there's an absolute chance you're going to get it if you're injected with it. And they also interview a French doctor. And again, Boylston was a doctor from here. They also have a doctor from France. There is another doctor from Scotland. These we know must be real doctors because they trained in Europe. And the French doctor reports that in Italy, he saw inoculation done. There were 13 soldiers, 4 of them died, 6 of them got gangrene and tumors. So do you really want to do this? And by this time, by the time they're interviewing Dr. Dalhond, there are 170 cases of smallpox in Boston. We went from 1 person to 8 people to 170 people, and the selectmen of Boston and the General Court of Massachusetts forbid more inoculations. They don't want Dr. Boylston or anyone else inoculating people with this terrible disease. Now, in addition to the disease spreading, this is all carried out in the press. That is, pamphlets are being written about smallpox. Here you see Benjamin Coleman. This is about smallpox, historical account. This is Boylston's pamphlet, and this is another Boylston pamphlet. This is an answer to Boylston on this. And so this is actually carried out in the press of Boston, a big argument about inoculation as the disease is spreading. And this is when James Franklin, who is a printer in Boston. He had just set up a printing press, and James Franklin thinks this would be a really useful way of drawing attention to his press. So at this moment, James Franklin creates a newspaper, the New England Courant, and the New England Courant is really started to oppose the doubtful and dangerous practice of inoculation against the smallpox. And one of their writers is a doctor from Scotland, the guy I mentioned, who criticizes the credulous, vain preacher. Who's the credulous, vain preacher? Cotton Mather, who's being instigated by Greek old women, madmen, and fools. And think about this. Mather got this idea from Turkey. That's one place. Does anyone know anything about the Ottoman Empire in 1720 and how Bostonians would have perceived it, or how the English-speaking world would have perceived the Ottoman Empire? Well, in addition to being virulently anti-Catholic, Bostonians were virulently against the Ottomans. In fact, they regarded the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and the Pope, one contemporary writer says, are the 2 feet of the Antichrist. So here you have an idea that's being presented from the Ottoman Empire. What about perception of Africans among Bostonians at this time? If an enslaved West African in Boston advises inoculation, is this something white people in Boston are going to say, that sounds like a good idea? Emma's saying no, she doesn't think it is, and I think you would be right. And further thing, the Courant asks, what do these things have in common? The persecution of the Quakers about the year 1658, the hanging of those suspected of witchcraft about the year 1691, and inoculation or self-procuring of smallpox in the year 1721. What do these things have in common? Executing Quakers, executing witches, giving yourself smallpox. And who's behind? Is the inoculation for smallpox religious-based? It's the Mathers. It doesn't matter if it's religious-based or not. Remember, Cotton Mather is a fellow of the Royal Society, and he is in touch with the leading thinkers of the English scientific world. He's the one advocating inoculation, but he's also the one who had advocated executing Quakers, executing witches. So you can see there's going to be grounds to question Cotton Mather about this. They also refer to Cotton Mather as a dunghill cock, a peevish mongrel, and a baboon. And Mather refers to the Courant as a hellfire club, a venomous crew in a spiteful town and a poisoned country. Now, by this time, something like 2,700 people have been infected with smallpox. Boston's population at this time is about 12,000. So 1 out of every 6 people in Boston by this time has smallpox, and 203 are dead. And despite the fact that the General Court and the Selectmen have banned inoculation, Boylston starts inoculating people. He actually starts with his servants, and then he inoculates his family and others, as the town is saying, you can't do this. You cannot inoculate people. So you have the smallpox spreading. I should say there's also a smallpox epidemic in London at this same time. Just to give you the numbers here. All in all, out of a population of about 12,000, nearly 6,000 people in Boston are going to get the smallpox, and 844 are going to die of smallpox. The same time in London, there is a smallpox outbreak. London's population is about 600,000, and about 5,000 people in Boston die. So fewer people die in London, a much bigger place, than die in Boston, or get the disease in Boston. You can work out the percentages, but we don't know that. Mather is the guy advocating inoculation, and the Current sees a useful target. People are going to want to read the Current because finally you have a newspaper saying really malicious things about Cotton Mather, who is a pretty easy target, I have to say. And in fact, someone throws a bomb through his window, and it doesn't go off, so we're able to see what the bomb says. Have I told you this before?
No.
There's a note attached to it that says, Mather, you dog, a pox on you, I'll inoculate you with this. Pretty straightforward message. Doesn't go off, and the governor offers a reward for anyone who can lead to the bomber, but the bomber is never found. So here you have Boston afflicted by smallpox, Cotton Mather advocating inoculation, and the James Franklin's printing press attacking Mather for advocating inoculation. Now, as I said, during this time, I didn't say this. During this time, in October of 1721, Mather's daughter, Abigail Willard, died. By the way, Mather has something like 15 children over the course of his life, and he will bury all but 2 of them. That is, his children die, and he has 3 wives successively. They die too. He doesn't have 3 wives at the same time. One of them goes mad, and very sad life. Think about this. Maybe this is why I empathize more with him than I should. But when his daughter dies, he preaches the sermon at her funeral. And this is at a time when he's under this public attack. He is being, people are throwing bombs through his window. They're calling him things like a dunghill cock in the press. And here he is the leading intellectual in Boston. He is the most prolific writer in Boston's history. And he's being called all of these names. And his sermon, preached at his daughter's funeral, really is about what you do when you're being attacked by this vengeful world. What is the best way to respond? Does anyone know what the best way to respond is when you're under attack by a vengeful, bitter world? You maintain a holy silence. And he publishes the funeral sermon under the name, or under the title, Silentarius, which is really a touching thing, a remarkable thing. And it also gives an opening to, well, we'll get back to this in a bit, Silentarius. It also, by the way, the authorities in Boston also recognize, even though they think Mather was wrong about inoculation, they don't like people throwing bombs through his window and otherwise attacking him. And so the authorities in Boston also suppress the Current, prevent James Franklin from issuing the newspaper. Now, at this time, you have Mather under attack, and James Franklin's younger brother, who's his apprentice, starts writing a series of satirical essays in the Current. And I don't think anyone mistook who these essays were aimed at, because they're written under the name Silence Do Good. Cotton Mather's most recent book, his most famous book. And the essays mock Mather as well as the establishment in Boston. They attack Harvard College. They point out, despite the fact Boston prides itself on its moral probity. If you walk on the common at night, you're going to see a lot of prostitutes, what are called doxies and sailors. And there are so many different words for drunkenness that people use. A poor person might get drunk, but others will become elevated, or other euphemisms for drunkenness. And Silence Dogood, who's writing these essays, is a middle-aged widow. She had married a clergyman, and those who had read this would also know Mather's Magnalia Christi, and they would see the plays on words, the plays on the stories from the Magnalia Christi Americana. And the second essay, which introduces Silence Dogood, says, I shall conclude this with my own character, which one would think I should be best able to give. Know then that I am an enemy to vice and a friend to virtue. I am one of an extensive charity and a great forgiver of private injuries, a hearty lover of the clergy and all good men, and a mortal enemy to arbitrary government and unlimited power. This all is describing Cotton Mather, a friend to virtue and enemy to vice, lover of the clergy and of good men, etc. I am naturally very jealous for the rights and liberties of my country, and the least appearance of an encroachment on those invaluable privileges is apt to make my blood boil exceedingly. I have likewise a natural inclination to observe and reprove the faults of others, at which I have an excellent faculty. No one has a better habit of reproaching the faults of others than Cotton Mather. I speak this by way of warning to all whose offenses shall come under my cognizance, for I never intend to wrap my talent in a napkin. To be brief, I am courteous and affable, good-humored unless I am first provoked, and handsome and sometimes witty, but always, sir, your friend and humble servant, Silence Dogood. Yes?
I could be wrong, but didn't Benjamin Franklin pretend to be a middle-aged woman named Silence Dogood?
This is Benjamin Franklin, the apprentice, James Franklin's apprentice, teenage brother, writing these essays, mocking Cotton Mather, as well as the New England establishment. So this is the new literary voice attacking Mather. And in fact, Benjamin Franklin, when James Franklin is arrested and can no longer is barred from publishing the newspaper, they signs it over to his brother Benjamin, the apprentice. Okay, you're right. So this is Benjamin Franklin slipping these under the door. Everyone is reading them, thinking, wondering, well, the other smart guys who hang around the printing office reading them, wondering who this could be, making fun of Cotton Mather. And another one, by the way, also makes fun of New England elegies, that is funeral poems, mocking the Puritans for the way they write verses eulogizing the dead. If you're in the mood, it's really kind of funny. The attack on the Puritan elegy. And he even gives a recipe for how to write a Puritan elegy. And it says, people complain that there isn't any good poetry written in this country, but this is the most extraordinary poem ever printed. Yes, Kathleen? An elegy is a poem about someone who is dead. Or it's a sad poem, typically. Probably the most famous is Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. It says that the paths of glory lead but to the grave. So they're making fun of the essence of Puritan thinking, as well as Puritans mourning the dead. I mean, poor Mehitabel Cattell, who is the subject of this elegy, and young Benjamin Franklin, under the name Silence Dogood, says this form of verse really should be called the Cattellic. You know, if it was making fun of my grandmother's elegy, I'd be pretty upset. So this is the beginning of Benjamin Franklin's literary career, taking on poor Cotton Mather, who's advocating inoculation for smallpox. Now, it turns out, as you're probably aware, inoculation actually worked. It actually did prevent the spread of the disease. And Cotton Mather reported later that upon both male and female, young and old, strong and weak, whites and blacks, tawnies, women in childbed, women with child at all seasons. And one of the doctors who had opposed inoculation later says that the smallpox seems to be somewhat more favorably received in inoculation than received in the natural way. So at the end, we realized that Cotton Mather was right and the Franklins were wrong. And Benjamin Franklin realizes this 15 years later when his 4-year-old son, Francis Franklin, who was known as Frankie, by the way, contracts smallpox when he's 4 years old and dies. And Franklin wrote in his autobiography, "I long regretted and still regret that I had not given it to him by inoculation." This I mention for the sake of parents who omit the operation on the supposition that they should never forgive themselves if a child died under it. My example showing that the regret may be the same either way, and therefore the safer should be chosen. So, despite the resistance to smallpox inoculation, I don't know if this answers your question, Kathleen, about dealing with disease, realized that it works. And by the time of the Revolution, it's being practiced, even though there's a smallpox outbreak in America at the time of the Revolution. Okay. Also at the time of the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin runs away from home when he's 16 and becomes a successful printer in Philadelphia. By the time he's 40, is probably one of the most successful men in the country. He's actually able to retire from his printing business to devote himself to science. And then science leads him into a career in politics. And in the early 1780s, he's living in France as one of the American ministers who's negotiated a treaty with the French by which they support the American Revolution. In fact, if you go to the Franklin statue, which is not far from where we are now, you'll see that the front of the statue has a scene in the printing shop. The back has the experiment with electricity. And on one side is the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the other side is Franklin signing the Treaty of Peace with England, a treaty signed in France in 1783. Now, he's in France and is probably by this time the most famous American of the century. And in fact, he says to his daughter that his face is more familiar in France than that of the man in the moon. You can buy figurines of Franklin, you can buy prints of Franklin, and he's in France, and he receives a letter from Samuel Mather. Samuel Mather is the son of Cotton Mather, and like his father, and like his grandfather, and like his great-grandfathers, he's a minister in Boston. And he also, like his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfathers, wrote advice to people. And he had written a book of advice to the American people, and he sent a copy to Benjamin Franklin, hoping that Franklin could help him promote the book. And Franklin writes back, "I received your kind letter with your excellent advice to the people of the United States, which I read with great pleasure and hope it will be duly regarded. Such writings, though they may be lightly passed over by many readers, yet if they make a deep impression on one active mind in 100, the effects may be considerable. Permit me to mention one little instance, which, though it relates to myself, will not be quite uninteresting to you. When I was a boy, I met with a book entitled Essays to Do Good, which I think was written by your father. It had been so little regarded by a former possessor that several leaves of it were torn out. But the reminder gave me such a turn of thinking as to have an influence on my conduct through life. For I have always set a greater value on the character of a doer of good than on any other kind of reputation. And if I have been, as you seem to think, a useful citizen, the public owes the advantage of it to that book. This is astonishing. Franklin, well, he'll tell us in a moment how old he is, but it is this book that Franklin says had made him into a doer of good. And in fact, when Franklin went to Philadelphia, he created a little club of other young working men, and every week they would get together and to ask, what are some of the things we can do to improve the town? This is something Cotton Mather was doing in Boston, getting together young, ambitious people to ask, what can we do to improve the town? What are public improvements we need? And every day, Franklin would begin his day asking, what good shall I do today? And at the end ask, what good have I done today? These are two questions that Cotton Mather says you should ask every day. That is, Franklin is taking Mather's lessons and applying them. And he recognizes that here in this letter. You mentioned your being in your 78th year. I am in my 79th. We are grown old together. It is now more than 60 years since I left Boston, but I remember well both your father and grandfather, having heard them both in the pulpit and seen them in their houses. The last time I saw your father was in the beginning of 1724, when I visited him after my first trip to Philadelphia. He received me in his library. So 1724, Franklin is 18. 3 years earlier, he had been writing the Silence Do-Good letters, mocking Cotton Mather, and then he comes back to Boston and calls on Cotton Mather. I don't know how many of you would have that particular effrontery to do that, but it's actually not a bad strategy. Going to call on Cotton Mather, who he now recognizes as not just a figure you can ridicule. So, on my taking leave, he showed me a shorter way out of the house through a narrow passage, which was crossed by a beam overhead. We were still talking as I withdrew, he accompanying me behind and I turning partly toward him when he said hastily, "Stoop, stoop." I did not apprehend what he meant until I felt my head hit against the beam. He was a man that never missed any opportunity of giving instruction. And upon this, he said to me, "You are young and have the world before you. Stoop as you go through it, and you will miss many hard thumps." This advice, thus beat into my head, has frequently been of use to me, and I often think of it when I see pride mortified and misfortunes brought upon people by their carrying their heads too high. I long much to see again my native place, and once hoped to lay my bones there. In fact, it's for that reason that he purchased a plot in the granary burying ground where his parents are buried, as well as his sister and his uncle and other members of the family. I left it in 1723. I visited it in 1733, 1743, 1753, and 1763. In 1773, I was in England. In 1775, I had a sight of it but could not enter, it being in possession of the enemy. I did hope to have been there in 1783, but could not obtain my dismission from this employment here, and now I fear I shall never have that happiness. My best wishes, however, attend my dear country, Esto Perpetua. It is now blessed with an excellent constitution may it last forever. To me, this is one of the most astonishing letters in Franklin's hand, as well as in many others, acknowledging the debt he owes to Cotton Mather and reminding us that Mather is a man who never missed an opportunity for instruction. So, any questions on this? I fear I always get carried away when I talk about Franklin and Mather. Suffice it to say that Boston, or Massachusetts and Boston really do have, it's both a period of some prosperity as well as a period of stagnation in the 1700s. One thing you see happening in Boston in this period is it's becoming more closely tied in with the West Indies, with the trade in sugar from the West Indies, codfish from New England, and Massachusetts becomes a summer resort for planter families from the West Indies. And here are 3 houses in the greater Boston area, all built by West Indian sugar planters. So this one, does anyone recognize any of the houses? This one in the town of Medford is built by the family of Isaac Royal, and Isaac Royal has a sugar plantation in Barbados, and the Royal House actually has the only remaining slave quarters in New England, because the house was built by the enslaved people from the West End, originally from Africa, who came up to build it using tropical wood in some of the interior rooms. This house is in Cambridge and was built by the Vassall family, another West Indian family, who also built houses in the surrounding area for other members of the extended family. This house, all the 3 houses still stand. All 3 are now museums. This one is the Royal House in Medford. This one became George Washington's headquarters during the Siege of Boston. And then in the early 1900s, it was purchased by the father-in-law of the poet Longfellow as a wedding gift for his daughter, who had married this poet who also taught at Harvard. The father-in-law was the wealthiest man in Massachusetts at the time, Nathaniel Appleton. And then this one, built by another branch of the Vassall family in what is now the city of Quincy. And in 1789, John and Abigail Adams bought it, moved in, and actually extended it. They built this addition in the 1790s. So you have a closer connection between New England and the West Indies. And you also have more acceptance of this connection with the rest of the British Empire through the Anglican Church. As I should have mentioned last time, during that 1685 to 1688, when Governor Andros had tried to establish the Dominion of New England, he also created or required that there be a Church of England in Boston. And he got a piece of land that was part of an old burying ground to build King's Chapel, which was initially a wooden structure in the 1740s. It was expanded, now a granite structure, which, anyone know where it is? Yes.
Is it on Tremont?
It's on Tremont Street.
Yeah.
It's on the next block from where we are. Okay.
Does it have a flag outside, a pride flag?
It probably does, yes.
Oh, is this the church right across from Park Street?
No, that's the Park Street Church.
No, that's the Park, no, the one on the corner across from.
No,
No?
that's the Episcopal Cathedral, which is the 1820s. No, King's Chapel was built initially in the 1680s. The current building was built in the 1740s. And at this time, they're also preparing to build a steeple, but it's an Anglican congregation, And at the time of the Revolution, most of the congregation flees. So they never finish the steeple. And then in the north end, they build Christ Church. Actually, this is Christ Church in the north end, now known as Old North, another Anglican church. So you have both more Episcopalian or Anglicans coming from England, as well as successful merchants here becoming part of the Anglican church. And okay, this is the Old North Church. This is the brick church, a new church built in actually in the north end. And you have trade being the thing really enriching people here. The trade of codfish going from New England to the West Indies, molasses coming back. So you have Boston really thriving as a merchant town, though at the same time, Philadelphia and New York are surpassing it, both in population and in wealth. And Boston has a number of problems, but that doesn't stop it from holding on and becoming, remaining, at least in its own mind, an important place. These are just other merchants, traders in Massachusetts. And you also have in the 1740s, you have the old state house here, the townhouse, and this is where the provincial government would meet. Built in 1713, there's a council chamber here, an assembly chamber here, first floor, a place for merchants to come in and get out of the rain. And in the 1740s, let's see, Peter Faneuil, who's a merchant of French descent, he's a French Protestant. And in the 1680s, the King of France revoked a long-standing edict that allowed Protestants to practice their religion in France. And King Louis XIV decided he only wanted Catholics in France, so revoked that edict, which meant the Protestants leave. And Benjamin Faneuil comes to Boston, becomes a successful merchant, and then realizing he is going to die and that he doesn't have an heir, he writes to his nephew living in outside New York in another French town called New Rochelle, founded by French folks, French Protestants, inviting his nephew, Peter Faneuil, to come to Boston, take over the business. He will inherit everything that his uncle has made on the provision he never married, because he doesn't want the money to leave the family. When he dies, it will all go to a brother. Interesting arrangement. So Peter Faneuil agrees, moves to Boston, takes over the business, the trading business, and realizes it would be beneficial actually to have a central marketplace. Of course, people who were not allied with Peter Faneuil, the merchant, were wary about giving him a central marketplace, because then it would be Peter Faneuil and those he liked engaging in trade. And so the people in Boston don't want to allow a central marketplace to be built, to replace all the little shops and warehouses along the docks. And Peter Faneuil then offers an inducement. How about if I build a marketplace, and on the second floor, you can have a place for the town meeting to happen? And the vote on this to allow Peter Faneuil to build a meeting place for the town meeting to happen, and the first floor will be a marketplace, the vote, I believe, was 616 in favor, 611 against. And so Boston allows Peter Faneuil to build this meeting place, which is known as what? Faneuil Hall. This is the original Faneuil Hall. It was expanded in 1806 because the town meeting grew. The town meeting involved every adult Protestant man over the age of 21 who owned property could vote in the town meeting. So to us, that may seem like, well, gee, not everyone got to vote. At the time, that was more democratic than any other place in the Western world or in the Eastern world. And one of the big issues for Boston in this period, as I mentioned, it has competition is the wrong word, from Philadelphia and New York, who had surpassed it in the importance of their trade. The real thing happening here, the real thing that sustains Boston in this period, is that between the 1690s and the 1760s, the British and the French empires are almost constantly at war. And because New France and New England are neighbors, this means there's going to be a lot of fighting in New England and along the waterways outside it. And Boston will be very important as the frontline city against the French Empire. And in the 1730s, the French built on Cape Breton, on the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, a fortress of Louisburg. This was the most heavily fortified position in the North Atlantic. So the St. Lawrence, huge river that leads into New France. And here is Cape Breton. Here is Nova Scotia. Boston is down here. And here, Louisburg, named of course for the king, is called the Gibraltar of the North Atlantic. The French have fortified this position, and then they use it so that French privateers can go out and capture ships from New England that are heading either back to England or to the West Indies. So Louisburg is a threat to Boston more than it is a threat to England. And Bostonians realized that, and in 1745, the governor of Massachusetts, William Shirley, takes advantage of the fact that the British fleet is here on its way to the West Indies to convince Commodore Charles Knowles that it would be a really good thing if he could bring Massachusetts troops up to Louisburg, because actually a couple of guys from Massachusetts who had been captured in Louisburg had been released, have come back, and these are guys who knew how to draw maps. They were really good at spying things out, and they reported on the fortifications of Louisburg and on how it was built to defend from the sea. They didn't expect anyone could attack from the land, but if you can land some forces here, they can actually take it from behind at the same time as you bring your fleet in and keep the French fleet bottled up or sink it in the harbor. And so Knowles does bring the Massachusetts forces up to Louisburg, and in 1745, they capture it. This is probably the greatest moment in Massachusetts' military history. And one of the things they bring back from Louisburg is this cross that had been on a church up there, brought back as a trophy of war and presented to Harvard College. This is a great moment for all of us, but I know you have lives to get to, and I may just have to spend the rest of the night thinking about the glory of Louisburg. The French, by the way, called it Louisburg, but since Massachusetts won, I'll call it Louisburg. And in 1804, when the Beacon Hill is created as a luxury neighborhood, the square at the center of Beacon Hill is called what? If you really made it in Boston, you are going to live on Louisburg Square on Beacon Hill. So, amen. Any questions?
Are you going to send any information about the immunity conference, about what we should do?
I did.
I have the email.
Yes.
Like we talked about it last time.
I sent you an email with instructions
Oh, you did?
as a group, right?
I have that.
Yeah. So basically start looking into the various resources of the Boston Public Library or our library, Boston Globe. What can you find about these people?
Globe,
Research.
yeah.
So, okay, if you have other questions, email me.
Professor,
Take care.
oh, Professor, I have a quick question.
Yes,
I'm catching up. I'm at the
yes,
point
Donna.
where,
I did email my partner, whatever. So will we write, like, can I just email and say, oh yeah, you can look up the accomplishments, I can look up the background, and we just write our own thing and then share it?
I couldn't hear all of what you said, Donna.
So I was saying, like, I tried to email my whatever guy partner.
Yes.
So like accomplishments and background, can he do one section and I could do the other and we write
Yes.
about it and source?
You can divide it up however you
Okay, and then talk about,
Okay,
okay, hopefully I get a hold of him. If I don't get a hold of him, can you get a hold of him for me?
let me see, who is your partner?
getting those stuff.
I think his name is,
Yeah, Jack Garbarino. Yeah,
Zach?
he's no longer with us. Yeah, no longer in the room, so, yeah. I gave you his email
Oh, okay.
and I gave him your.
I did, I emailed him. I'm just, yeah,
I'll try again.
I emailed him. Yeah, I'll try again, and if not, I'll email you.
Okay, good.
All right, have a good night. Thanks for the lecture.
Take care.
Now that my friend who I watched,
Right.
where the link again, like she came over last Thursday and watched 5 episodes of TV. In a row.
With our admin on both before Thursday or?
No, that's after.
Start another.
The first step is to see what you can find out about your eminent